Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LPL Semifinals overview and analysis video. We are down to the final 3 teams here in the LPL, and I'm very excited to be able to go over this series. Of course, we've covered every single LPL playoff game up until this point. You can check those all out on this channel. I've got a link up in the iCard right now to every single video that I've covered in the LPL, this split up until this point, playoffs included, but we are finally here, final 3, and by the end of this video, we are going to know the final 2 teams in the summer split here in 2023, so exciting stuff. Who's going to be moving on to face JD Gaming in the finals? We're going to find out here today, but would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions, not only on this series, but on the LPL as a whole, of course. With Worlds right around the corner, you know, we might get a good idea. We might actually get it locked in, depending on the outcome here. The 2 main and first teams that are going to be qualifying for the World Championships from the LPL. JDG is already going, but you know, one of our teams could solidify a spot in the World Championships if they're able to win here today, but would love to know just your thoughts and opinions on everything. This series, the LPL, the whole 9 yards. Would let me know down in the comments section below. But with all that being said, let's jump right into the overview. Of course, if you're new here, what we do on this channel is we're going to go game by game in this series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I will be giving out a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in the series. And then at the end of the series, I'm going to go ahead and give a player of the series as a whole here in the semifinals. Of course, at the end of the video, we're going to know our final 2 teams. I'll give a little bit of a preview as to what I think could go down in the finals, and then I'll talk a bit about how this ends up affecting the regional qualifiers for the LPL to determine the final 2 teams that end up making the World Championships. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about the series that you all came here to listen to me talk about, and that was a matchup between the number 1 seeded Bilibili Gaming and the number 3 seeded LNG Esports. Really intriguing matchup on paper. I'm actually really excited that we're getting this in the playoffs rather than a rematch of any of the matchups, you know, a couple rounds ago in round number 4. You know, BLG TES would have been fun, but we already saw it, and same thing with JDG LNG. Really excited to get BLG LNG here. I think this is a very intriguing matchup between 2 very, very good teams. Of course, BLG nearly unstoppable over the course of this year. It's been really difficult to see a lot of teams even be able to take a candle to them, but they end up in the losers bracket here because of their old rivals, JD Gaming, who they just can't seem to get past. They ended up losing in winners finals to get here. But they're still a really good team, right? They went 15-1 in the regular season for a reason. They are incredibly talented, incredibly consistent, and everything has really kind of clicked for BLG. Their mid games are very dangerous. They've gotten really consistent over the back half of games at being able to close things out, but they so consistently are able to generate leads in the early parts of the game because their laning is so strong that it's very difficult to actually overcome them. But if there ever was a team that matched up relatively well against Bilibili, it's actually LNG in my eyes, because they're one of the few teams that genuinely has the talent to be able to match them in lane. Scout, Gala are 2 phenomenal laners. Scout is just as good as Yagao, and that's a big strength for BLG. Getting Yagao on the map, moving him around, generating pressure that way. And then Gala versus Elk is a super intriguing matchup. Gala and Hang versus Elk and On is a very intriguing matchup just in general. I really like Tarzan and Tajun. Zika into Bin is certainly going to be something to watch. There are a lot of fun matchups in this series, but LNG really was not able to go toe-to-toe with BLG in the regular season. This was a big blowout series for BLG, and so LNG definitely looking for some revenge, but they're going to need to change up their strategy. They're a much better team now than they were back then, earlier in the season when they ended up facing BLG, and, you know, taking JDG to 5 games, I think definitely proved that in round number 4, but this is going to be a massive series for them. I think it's going to be up to, like I said in the preview, who the best player in this series is. If Scout or Gala or Tarzan can step up and be the best player for LNG, I really do think that they're going to be able to win. But, you know, Bin, Jun, Yagal, Elk, and On are a tough 5 to be able to overcome, and you really need everybody on the side of LNG to step up and be strong. And so are they going to be able to do it, or is Bilibili going to give us our Destiny finals of Knight and Yagal once again, you know, with the 2 best teams from the regular season? Well, we're going to find out, starting, of course, with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Bilibili Gaming, they are able to take the first game of this series. They're able to go up 1-0, and this isn't a particularly big surprise start to this series. BLG obviously has been super good, and like I said, they've kind of had LNG's number over the course of this year. Up until this point, this team has just been basically unstoppable outside of one specific organization, and LNG has not been that. It's only game one. I don't want to overreact, but this was a really good game from BLG. They were able to generate a lot of pressure in the early game, mostly through some fantastic early pathing from June in the jungle, and they just translated that into consistent leads growing and growing and growing throughout the game until it was basically over like it was in this one. So let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the game in game number 1 is going to go to Elk in the bot lane. He struggled a little bit going up against JDG. I felt like, in general, the bot lane 2v2s really weren't all that successful for BLG, and that's been a major strength of theirs over the course of this year, and I think that was a big reason why BLG had so much trouble going into JD Gaming, obviously getting swept in that series, but Elk was much better at the start of this. This bot lane 2v2, like I talked about in the preview, is going to be incredibly influential throughout this entire series, in my opinion, because Gala and Elk are so influential in what both of these teams really want to do over the course of an entire game. And I think with Elk stepping up and really being able to get super far ahead on that Xayah going into more of a passive early laning phase, but more of a hyper carry in the Aphelios, I think that was definitely a positive for BLG. Going to be interesting to see if LNG ends up switching up their scenarios there, because I think allowing Elk and On to get so much prio early because of the lane matchup is just a problem. They're going to do so much with it. And BLG in general is going to be able to expedite that process really, really quickly. But I think Broadcast ended up giving player of the game over to June in the jungle, and this one, again, I totally agree on the Sejuani. Really good game from him. You know, Elk was great. He's going to get my player of the game because I think he did the most with the resources that he was given, and was certainly the player that I was tracking the most throughout the game, but June was doing so much on the map for what BLG was able to accomplish. He out-jungled Tarzan in the early game, and from that point onwards, the Sejuani is actually just going to be ridiculously difficult to deal with. If you can get the LeBlanc moving around as well, you know, with the strong Xayah, that's going to be able to win you a lot of these mid-game skirmishes where they really did start to blow up their lead. It just becomes almost impossible to be able to break through that. You look at the side of LNG, like Maokai, Azir, Aphelios, like, yes, you have so much late-game teamfight potential in that little cluster there, but losing those mid-game skirmishes is actually pretty disastrous for this comp, because you need a lot of time in order for this comp to end up working, and not just in terms of game time, but in terms of time in the fights, right? You need Azir and Aphelios to have time to be able to fire off. They're not this big burst combo. They need DPS, right? And if you've got LeBlanc and Xayah on the other side, like, you're just not going to be able to deal with that. And it's going to take way too long to break through things like the Alistair, the Sejuani, and the Cassante in the late game, which I think definitely became a little bit of a problem for LNG. So really good stuff from Bilibili. Elk and June, in my opinion, definitely the standout members, but Bin was really good on the Cassante. No real major surprises there. His team fighting is just so ridiculously strong. Obviously, he's a great laner as well, and going into Zika, who was playing the Renekton, it's definitely great to see Bin be able to step up and play that lane strongly, because we've seen, you know, good players not be able to play it nearly as well, but I think the rest of the team, Yagao, On, everybody really performed here in game number 1. This was definitely BLG favored, but for LNG, on the other side, this was a relatively poor game number 1. I'm going to be entirely honest with you. You didn't really generate a lot of pressure and a lot of confidence in this game, and I think that's okay. Like, there were moments, and obviously it's just game 1. You're going to be able to bounce back, you know, ideally, or at least you have an opportunity to be able to bounce back, but you really just kind of got outplayed here. You lost a lot of pressure in the early game. Tarzan, in particular, really didn't have a lot of pressure, even though I do think he tried his best in the mid-game. He was probably the best mid-game performer out of everybody on LNG to try and keep this game active, but again, the Maokai was just a little bit too far behind by that point to really make any sort of impact, and the mid-game skirmishes were so in favor of Bilibili that it was actually kind of difficult for LNG to be able to survive. But I go back to this comp. Like, yes, Azir Aphelios is going to be near unstoppable if you hit those late-game breakpoints, but that's a very risky strategy to play into somebody like BLG, right? Into this specific team that has so consistently been able to generate a lot of early leads, and Scout and Gala have been fantastic over the course of this playoff run, mostly on things that are able to generate their own momentum. Scout in particular, like, I love Azir. I think he's a really good pick, and obviously he's very consistent, but he's going to lose prio to the LeBlanc in the early game, and Yagao's going to be able to move around the map and help that Sejuani out a lot more than Azir is going to be able to do the same thing for Maokai, and I just don't know if that's the ideal situation for Scout in this particular moment, or this matchup, I should say. I do love Scout as a late-game hyper carry. We've seen what this team has been able to do in terms of late-game team fighting. Gala is obviously a big part of that as well, but his 2v2 laning phase has also been strong. putting him into a matchup that really was kind of not conducive to him being aggressive in the early game, I think was definitely a negative. But my dead of the game personally is going to go to Hang in the support position on this rel. I do think there are opportunities in the mid game for some really good engages and some really important, kind of momentum-changing plays, if you will, for LNG, and I don't think Hang took advantage of as many of them as I would like to see. The rel can be a very aggressive pick, something that really can change the fate of a game if you land some really good, ultimates or really good engages just in general to set up for Azir and for the Aphelios, but there just wasn't enough damage to be able to capitalize on some of those rel engages, and then the ones that I think they did have enough damage, they just weren't consistent enough, and so Hang's gonna get dead of the game. But again, I really do think it was just kind of a pressure gap. It wasn't exactly a mechanical gap. I think Scout and Gala are this team's two best players by a considerable margin, and neither of them had prio in the early game in their matchup. You're relying a ton on Tarzan being able to basically generate it on his own in a matchup that is 50-50. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's going to be difficult for Tarzan to kind of destroy this matchup as Maokai, but Zika and Hang weren't exactly dominating in their particular roles either. LNG just kind of, I think, put themselves into a bad corner, but they've still got time to be able to fight their way out of it. They certainly don't want to go down 0-2 to BLG, but Game 2, if they're able to win, it ties up the series and makes it a lot more achievable for them to be able to kind of get back in this series. But for BLG, if you are able to generate that 2-0 lead, that's massive for the rest of this series. It just puts you in such a driver's seat, and it makes it so difficult. Losing 3 games in a row is not something that BLG does very often, but are they going to be able to generate that lead, or is LNG going to be able to tie up the series in game number 2? Well, the winner of game number 2 was LNG. They are able to take game 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and this is a really nice win for this team. Obviously, talked about it before. You don't want to be down 0-2 against a team like Bilibili Gaming. They're just simply too clinical from a point of confidence that if you give them all of that confidence, you give them 3 shots to be able to win a game, they're probably going to hit at least one of those, and so really good from LNG to be able to even up this series, and I think they played relatively well. I think this comp was a little bit more versatile in terms of how they could play out the game. I think the Xayah almost completely changes how this team ends up playing, even though you're still looking at a Maokai Azir jungle mid duo, and you're still looking at a lack of pressure in the early game, which still was kind of true for LNG, but this game was actually really close, and you might not see it again from the gold differential, but that thing really ballooned towards the back half of this game once the Azir really got online and started destroying all of these front-to-back 5v5 team fights. But LNG was actually not in a position to dominate for this entire game. BLG, I think, still did a lot of things really right in this game. Their core players, I think, were still relatively good, but a couple of major mistakes and one major gap in a lane, I think, really ended up sealing the fate for BLG here in game 2. But player of the game for me is going to go to Scout in the mid lane. He really was the one that took over this game towards the back half on this Azir. He was so influential at being able to win the crucial team fights that ended up getting them this gigantic lead that blew the game open at around 25 minutes into the game. And without Scout, I think this game would have been so much harder because he really is that good at Azir. I know I was kind of criticizing the pick, and it wasn't because I don't think Scout is good at Azir. Obviously, Scout's very good at Azir. You could argue it's his best champion of all time. He won a world championship on it, and so you're certainly not going to complain too much about it, but I just didn't like the idea of losing pressure in the mid lane by, essentially taking a pick that needs to scale and allowing Yigao to have something like LeBlanc that loves to be moving around the map alongside a jungler, and especially if you're going to pair it up with something aggressive like the Kha'Zix, that's a lot of pressure in the mid game that is unaccounted for. It really puts you in a position where your jungler has to play a ton better, right? Like, you're essentially putting a lot more pressure onto Tarzan by doing this for Scout, but if Tarzan plays well, then it's worth it, because you do hit this late game break point where Azir is just going to be the strongest thing in the game, even going up against something like Aphelios, so long as Kha'Zix and LeBlanc don't have an easy avenue to just blow up the Azir, and they didn't in this game. Some really good stuff coming in from LNG, and Scout definitely paid it out in terms of damage. He was fantastic, and his execution, I think, is really what put this over the top. If you don't have arguably the best player in the LPL right now on LNG, I think this game is a lot harder, but because you do have Scout, then things ended up working out. I think the other player that you've got to shout out here is Zika in the top lane. What a killer game from him. I love Ben. Ben has been fantastic, but this was a gap. I mean, Zika was phenomenal across this entire game on the Gnar. He dominated the laning phase was consistently up in terms of pressure onto Bin on this K'Sante, who just had a really good game into a, what I would consider worse matchup earlier on, even though I don't think Gnar is easy by any stretch of the imagination for K'Sante to play into, but the Gnar was dealing so much damage. I know we kind of associate Gnar with kind of the, being an engaged tank and more of a frontliner because of Mega Gnar, but man, that champion can still really hurt and create a ton of avenues. I think if it was just the Azir in the back half of this game, it would have been a lot more difficult, but Zika on the Gnar, I think, really did separate some things. It was the solo laners that really stepped up for LNG in game 2. Tarzan, I think, played much better than he did in game number 1, and that helped out a lot. Gala and Hang were good. Again, adding pressure into a Xayah lane in the early game is just generally going to be fine. BLG went for something that was significantly more passive in the early game with the Aphelios and the Braum. Not really able to create as much in the early 2v2, but is going to be really good towards the back half of the game, and obviously can skirmish as well, especially pairing that up with like a Kha'Zix LeBlanc, but I think in general, it just gave Gala and Hang more ability to play on the front foot, which I think is something that they're really good at as players. And so just generally, I thought LNG played really well in this game and their players stepped up. And then for BLG, you had a little bit of a priority in this game. You just weren't able to close it out. I think if you were better in team fights, I think this game would have gone your way. I'm not going to criticize a lot of the carries. I think Jun and Yagao were staying active in the early game as they should in this comp. And I think Elk in particular had a relatively good back half of the game. He just wasn't able to out-carry the Azir, which again is fine, but I think the ancillary pieces, the kind of supportive pieces on BLG really did struggle in this one. Bin in particular just had a pretty bad game. He's going to get dud of the game, and this one was pretty obvious for me. Zika was fantastic throughout the entire game, was definitely the better top laner in this series, and that's not really what you want to see out of Bin, who is, a really, really good player, arguably the best top laner in the world right now, and so to see him struggle so much on the K'Sante is definitely frustrating. He wasn't really all that good in the team fight stage, just as he wasn't good in the lane stage, and so I think BLG, if they got a maybe a better performance out of their top laner, it could have been a little bit closer, but for the most part, a big problem was Zika's Gnar and him being able to deal so much damage, but I don't think On was particularly useful in this game. This is kind of the downside of Braum. I really do like this pick a lot, but when you're having to play from a more disadvantageous position and you don't necessarily have a ridiculous amount of damage to just sit there and protect, you're just going to get out-damaged, right? Like, the Braum's going to melt to this Azir in the late game, and that's unfortunately kind of the circumstance that ended up happening, is that LNG ended up just killing the front line a little bit too quickly, and the back line wasn't nearly fast enough to be able to make the most of it, because you're going into another strong front line, especially that Gnar, but even that Maokai was incredibly difficult to get through. BLG just didn't have the firepower to be able to close this one out, but I do think that this team still played more than fine, and it's just one loss, right? The series is tied up now at 1 apiece. Going into Game 3, though, this is going to be a very important one. Being able to take control of this series again is going to be massive for BLG. You want that confidence, but LNG in general, if you win 2 games in a row against BLG, who is to say that you can't win 3, right? And so this is a massive middle game of the series, and I think it's going to be very, very important for both teams to be able to come out on top in this one, but we're going to see who is going to be the one that ends up taking it, because the winner of game number 3 was LNG. They are able to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and this is a massive swing. And a lot of other people, I think, expected BLG to be able to take care of business in this series relatively cleanly. I think BLG in general has just looked relatively unstoppable against a lot of other teams that aren't named JD Gaming, but they're now on the back foot. They're 1 game away from being eliminated here in the LPL Summer Playoffs and not even being able to make it to finals when it really felt like a top 2 all split long, which would be a disaster for Bilibili considering just how things have gone up until this point this year. But for LNG, this is massive. This team is absolutely peaking at the right time, and I'm just really happy to talk about it. I'm really happy to say that a lot of these players are stepping up, and their game plans feel incredibly solid right now. And this one, we talked about Game 2 being a little bit more up and down, maybe not necessarily as dominant as Game 1 was for BLG, but Game 3 was very similar to Game 1 in a lot of different ways. It was LNG being able to create quite a bit of pressure early going into a comp that really needed that pressure. I mean, Nidalee, Jace, Xayah, Blitzcrank. A lot of these things really need prio so that they can play so aggro in the mid game. That's where you're really going to blow up with the BLG comp, is like if you can get a bunch of damage off basically for free with Nidalee and Jace poke, and then, Blitzcrank hooking somebody random in that just gets completely obliterated almost instantly by this team. It makes it very difficult to try and contest objectives, but LNG played really safe, and they made sure that they were in a position of aggression over the course of this game, and so when they did end up getting caught a couple of times, it didn't end up really mattering. Most of it was on the Leona, and they still had more than enough firepower to be able to trade something back usually in a lot of different cases. So good stuff from LNG. Player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Gala in the bot lane for me. You can't put him on Kai'Sa, man. Gala Kai'Sa is just simply too good. I get that you traded over June's Nidalee and On's Blitzcrank, and so you essentially got one, I guess, well-known pick for another. But the Kai'Sa is simply stronger in the current meta, and you're able to do so much more with it. I think LNG really played around the power of that Kai'Sa really well. You can really match a lot of the long-range ability that BLG's comp offers, which is one of the main advantages, is that they don't really ever have to play super aggro, because they can rely on blitz hooks and poke to be able to just kind of win a lot of their fights. But you know, if Gala's going to be able to pop off, if he's going to be able to get into that backline and deal a ridiculous amount of damage with that ultimate, or go in secondary after we get like a full Gnar plus Maokai plus Leona engage and LeBlanc potentially blowing up somebody, and then, you know, Kai'Sa can essentially clean, it makes the job so much easier for him, and I think that they executed on that really well. Gala's been phenomenal for this team, like underratedly phenomenal. He's not getting, I'm not going to say he's not getting the credit he deserves, because people know how good Gala is. And people know that he's been a major upgrade for this team, but he's a big reason why they're here. He's, you know, him and Scout, I think, have really been the two driving forces for LNG over the course of this year, and I think it's definitely coming to fruition in this series. Scout continues to be great. Highest damage in the game on the LeBlanc. Again, that's all this champion does, is deal the most amount of damage in the game. There are some vocal fans that say that LeBlanc does no damage. Those people are insane. You see it in every single post-match thread. I don't know what they're smoking. It's actually kind of insane, but Scout continues to look fantastic, this time on a champion that is going to be able to play at least a little bit more aggro. The unfortunate part, he's got to play it into Jace, so he's still not necessarily going to have the most amount of prio in the mid game, but I actually think Scout did a much better job than Yagao in this game of being able to generate that pressure, even if the Jace was dealing a lot of damage throughout. And then Tarzan was so much better in this game, neutralizing what Nidalee was able to do in the early game, trying to make sure that she didn't get into that mid to late game and become like a problem in terms of damage. Kind of resorted June into being more of a heal bot towards the back half of this game, and Maokai in particular is just going to have so much more versatility over the back half, and I think LNG played around that well. Zika's been fantastic across this entire series, and even if Hang's scoreline isn't exactly phenomenal, I still think that he was more so a positive, if only because he was the one that was eating a lot of the engage from BLG and was still getting a lot of the CC off. Ended up dying in order to get, you know, 4 or 5 kills on the side of LNG. I would consider that a worthwhile trade. And so, really good game from LNG, but BLG is now 1 game away from being eliminated. That is not where you want to be as a team that went 15-1 in the regular season. You kind of expected to get to finals, and I think really there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be surprised if you're not going to be able to overcome this LNG team, but again, a lot of negatives. I think that their tempo has been significantly worse over the past 2 games, especially here in Game 3, where you pick this comp that really relies a ton on it, where you rely on jungle pressure and tempo, and June just wasn't necessarily able to generate as much of that on a champion in Nidalee, who, yes, it's June's signature pick, and he's really good at it, but it's really not very good right now. Like, Nidalee just doesn't really do all that much. You've got the Jace, and I understand the idea behind trying to power through that mid lane in the early game, and for the most part, I think they were able to do that with Yagao's damage, but the mid game is really where you need to solidify a lot of that prio, and they just didn't have it. Like, LNG was just so much more active. They had a gold lead throughout this entire game, and you could see it in the way that they were playing. They were playing up, they were playing aggressive, and they weren't scared of BLG, which ended up creating problems. The Blitzcrank ended up being completely useless. He's going to be my dud of the game on that is on the Blitzcrank, and that's because really what happened this game that the Blitzcrank really created, your only targets are really, I mean, your only target is really the Kai'Sa. Nobody else is really ever going to be a good target. Maybe Mini Gnar, but like, when are you ever going to get the chance to hook Mini Gnar in a team fight? And so, you know, really, it's just Kai'Sa, and you're never going to be able to get onto the Kai'Sa. You've got the Maokai, you've got the Leona. Hell, even the LeBlanc can probably block a hook, because not only of clone, but because she can clone out. She can just dash out if things go poorly for her. And so the Blitzcrank ended up being not very useful, even if I do consider it kind of a signature pick, probably On's best pick at this point. It ended up not working out. Elk was not nearly as good in this game as he was through the first 2, which I think was a problem. And honestly, Bin's been the worst top laner this series, not because he's been miserable. He was pretty bad in game 2, but because Zika has been phenomenal on this Gnar. He's been a huge difference maker for this team, and Bin's just not been able to keep up. BLG is now on the brink of elimination, and that's not particularly good for them. It wouldn't be the end of the world, obviously, because even if they lose, there still is a chance that they auto-qualify for Worlds, but, you know, you don't want to put yourself in that situation. You want to, at the very least, bring this to a game number 5, but are they going to be able to do that, or is LNG kind of going to shock the world and end this series in 4 games? Well, the winner of game number 4 was LNG. They are able to take game 4, and that's going to be your series. LNG is going to be able to take it in 4 games. That's a 3-1 series win for them, and they're going to be moving on to the LPL Summer Split Semifinals to take on JD Gaming. Bilibili has officially been eliminated. It's technically not even the end of their automatic qualification bid, though. We'll get into that as we get further along because, you know, LNG hasn't officially qualified for anything at this point other than the qualifier, but a fantastic game and a fantastic series from LNG. I think me included, a lot of people just assumed that this was going to be BLG's to lose. Not only because of how they had played throughout the regular season, but specifically because of how they matched up against a team like LNG, who is very top-heavy, not necessarily the most consistent. A team like BLG seems basically perfectly positioned to be able to deal with a team like LNG, but not so much. Want to give a big congratulations to this LNG team. I think they played this series phenomenally. Basically, everybody stepped up and did their part, but obviously, it's going to be the main focal points that end up being the spotlight carries for this series, but everybody really did play at a fantastic level. You don't win 3 games in a row against Bilibili Gaming in 2023 if you're not playing at a super high level, and you've got to give a lot of credit to the entire team. But my player of the game and my player of the series here in game number 4 is going to go to Scout in the mid lane. Not only was he awesome on this Tristana, he was great throughout this entire series, was really the anchor point, and again, it's just kind of been the case for LNG that Scout has kind of been the guy for this team throughout the year. We were talking about Scout kind of being on the downturn of his career. People were laughing at an org like T1 because they were prepping for life without Faker, and Scout was looked at as a potential replacement for him. And we were all like, Scout could never be Faker. I know he's won a world title, but Viper carried him, or Jeje carried him, or insert whatever, right? Mako carried him, insert whatever narrative, right? But he comes over here to LNG, and he is consistently the best player in the LPL throughout 2023. Just an amazing year, arguably the best of his entire career, of, you know, his Hall of Fame level career, or whatever you want to call it. Scout's been phenomenal, and he's really stepped up for this team in the playoffs. He was great against JD Gaming, really took down top esports, and now was like the driving force for being able to beat Bilibili. He has been everything they could have asked him to be and more. He's player of the game here in game 4 on this Tristana. Again, something aggressive that he can play really aggro on in the early game and then just move around the map and cause chaos. He's the one going into the Azir in this one, and man, if Tristana is going to be able to generate that early lead, like, Azir's never really going to be able to catch up. Tristana can still do a lot in the late game. It's why she's one of the most prioritized mid laners in the entire game right now, but pair that up with the Maokai, you know, and Tarzan, who plays those champions really well. Gala and Hang, I think, played really well. Zika was major across this entire series, but in this game as well, the Tristana just was able to take over and do absolutely everything she wanted to do, and Scout was fantastic. He's going to deserve every bit of praise that he's gotten for this series and for this year, and man, it's just really, really good to see. But like I said, rest of the team was great. Tarzan out-jungled June, I would say, every game, especially towards the back half of the series. Games 3 and 4, I think, were the most noticeable in terms of Tarzan being able to get a massive lead, obviously, with the exception of game 1. I think everything really went Tarzan's way. I don't even think it was necessarily a major problem in game 1. He just kind of got out-pressured in the early game, but the Maokai, I think, definitely was massive for LNG. Gala was a fantastic carry. He just does so much damage so consistently, and if you're going to play into something like Ezreal, being able to take advantage of that is huge. Hang was kind of the one who had to take some stuff for the team in this series, but playing the Leona, being able to get that CC off, that's all you really need to do. It doesn't really matter if you're the one that ends up going down for it. I think he was, for the most part, still good, even if his scoreline's probably worse than the rest of the teams. And then Zika, what a standout performance from him. He was phenomenal in games 2 and 3 in particular, a little bit less so in game number 4 here, if only because he had to go into a consistently split-pushing, kind of fed Fiora on the other side of the map, but Zika was still really, really good for this team, and I don't think they get into the finals nearly as cleanly if Zika hasn't had as good of a playoff run as he has had. He's been a major positive for this team and a big reason why they're there, but LNG is looking great. We're going to preview their matchup against JDG later on in the episode, but for Bilibili, that ends your summer split, and I think it ends it a lot earlier than maybe you anticipated it would end. There were a couple of positives to take away from this game, Bin in particular on the Fiora. He had actually been a little bit of a concern in this series up until this point. Games 2 and 3 were certainly not the biggest positives for him, but game 4 really was him just trying to 1v9 split push on the Fiora. Basically, if BLG was able to survive a lot of those engages coming in from LNG, Fiora could have done a lot of damage, I think, in this, but they just didn't have the strength to be able to do so, and LNG was just too strong on that side of the map, so Bin really wasn't able to affect it too much, but definitely his best game of the series, in my opinion. Yagao was the other player that I think you could talk about at least doing something this game, but everybody else was really just kind of on the back foot the entirety of this game. June certainly lost a lot of pressure early in the Sejuani. He never really came into play, but the bot lane was really an issue for BLG, and this was the same case in the JD Gaming series. I'm not going to get concerned about Elkin On, but they are a little bit more feast or famine than maybe some of the other best bot lanes in the world, which is the category that Elkin On have absolutely deserved to put themselves into at this point. but they've really struggled in the recent weeks. You know, these players have been a little bit inconsistent over the course of their career, and it's definitely unfortunate to see them kind of bow out in summer, playing a little bit worse than expected, but the Ezreal certainly had no impact on this game, and on just in general, he's going to get dead of the game on the Rel, was just a little bit underwhelming this series. A lot of the engages were really lackluster and really weren't up to the standard that we've kind of known that he can generate as a player. He's been the best support in China over the course of this year, and he certainly hasn't performed like it in the playoffs, which is definitely concerning, but I think the bot lane in general is probably going to be fine, and again, like I said earlier, Bilibili still has a chance and an opportunity to auto-qualify for Worlds without having to play in the regional qualifier. LNG is going to the finals, but if they don't win the finals, they still don't have enough championship points to end in the top 2, and so certainly something to keep in mind, but for Bilibili, you hate leaving your fate for that up into the hands of a different team, and as good as LNG is, they're not exactly going to be favorites heading into that finals series, and so for BLG, you know, maybe you auto-qualify, maybe you don't. But either way, I think this team might honestly prefer to play in a place like the regional qualifier so that they have a chance to get some of their confidence back, because this is probably not the end to the split that they were looking for after dominating the regular season so much. But either way, still a really good year and still a really high chance they do end up going international and maybe making a big surprise. It's just probably not the way they wanted to end summer. And then for LNG, this is basically a dream scenario. You're in the LPL finals, and I'm really excited for this team. Tarzan, Scout, Gala, we're going to preview that final series in just a second, but congratulations to this team and their ability to turn a lot of things around. A lot of people were not believing in some of these players. Tarzan in particular was getting so much hate over the course of this year, but look at them now. They are now one of the top 2 teams in the LPL, and they're only one series away from being able to make it to an international tournament again. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL semifinals overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed, but let's quickly go ahead and preview our final series of the LPL Summer Split. It's a finals matchup between the number 2 seeded JD Gaming and the number 3 seeded LNG Esports, and man, I'm excited for this. Obviously, we got this in round number 4. JDG was able to take it, but it was a very close 5-game series. LNG fought them a lot harder than I think a lot of people were expecting them to be able to fight, and I'm really excited for the rematch here. Most specifically, I think the matchup that you have to point out is the jungle matchup, Tarzan versus Kanavi. Very, very interesting. 2 former Griffin junglers going head-to-head against each other. It's always going to be interesting and a fun matchup, but Knight versus Scout, arguably the 2 best mid laners in the LPL right now, and I certainly would agree with that statement. I think they clearly have been, but even Ruler versus Gala, I mean, how are you going to overlook that? Zika's really stepped up going up against a player in 369 in the top lane, and it's not like Missing and Hang are weaknesses by any stretch. These are 10 really, really good players, world-class players. And I'm really excited to see how it's going to go down, but I want to know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to be able to take it? You know, for my money, obviously, it's just so hard to bet against JD Gaming at this point, but would love to know what you guys think, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. But, of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions and the NACL, and playoffs are going through all of them. A lot of them are getting close to wrapping up, but we've got the regional qualifiers, and of course, Worlds just around the corner. If you want some in-depth analysis on a lot of the teams that are going to be heading to those international tournaments, this is the place for that. Go ahead and hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.